Hello, very warm welcome if you're watching on PBS and indeed around the globe. One of the world's most criticised polluters, Australia, has formally adopted a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It joins other countries around the world in promising to make the nation carbon neutral by then. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, made the long-delayed pledge after bargaining with resistant MPs within his government.
Australians want action on climate change. They're taking action on climate change, but they also want to protect their jobs and their livelihoods. They also want to keep the cost of living down, and they also want to protect the Australian way of life, especially in rural and regional areas.
Let's get some analysis now from our correspondent in Sydney, Shaima Khalil.
It took months of political wrangling, but the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has finally announced that Australia will adopt the target of zero carbon emissions by 2050 and that he will be taking the government's plan to the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow. Now, the fact that it took so long and has been left down to the wire with days before the summit tells you how complicated this process is and how politically divisive climate action is in Australia. Essentially, the government needed the support of its junior coalition partner, the National Party. They represent electorates in regional and rural Australia, where most of the carbon-intensive industries are, like the coal mining industry, for example. And after days of toing and froing and talks and political concessions made by the government, the Nationals have said we support this process, and this is why the leadership has now been able to stand up and say in no uncertain terms that they are adopting zero emissions by 2050. But he did not make it clear how the government is going to strike that balance, how they plan to keep coal mining, for example, and also achieve net zero by 2050, especially that they have not budged on their 2030 targets. Many have criticized them for being too low, too modest, and just don't reflect the urgency of the climate situation at the moment.
Shaima Khalil there. Well, let's speak to Richard Merzian, Director of the Climate and Energy Programme at the Australia Institute. That's a think tank based in Canberra. What do you make of this pledge and the fact that it's apparently going to be achieved without cutting the fossil fuel sector?
Hello, Ben. It's a lacklustre plan. You can't reach net zero by 2050 and still allow fossil fuels to flourish. Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels, arguably the largest for coal. In fact, Australia exports more coal than Saudi Arabia does oil as a percentage of the world market. And this will see more coal. By the end of this year, Adani will ship its first shipment of coal from its controversial mine. We're going to see 20 more mine proposals on the table. We've got 3 big new gas basins. You can't see how you can marry these two things up. And unfortunately, there's very little detail underneath this plan.
There's also been criticism about the lack of interim targets for 2030, which a lot of nations are setting as part of the COP26 climate summit. Do you think that is significant in terms of Australia failing to make those interim pledges and targets or not?
It is curious, given that the government also went out of its way to say we're going to meet and beat the target, the interim target that it set before the Paris Agreement, which is to reduce emissions 26% by 2030. By comparison, the UK is reducing its emissions 68% by 2030. And so there's a lot more room for Australia to move forward with an interim target. That is, after all, what the point of Glasgow is, to raise those short-term ambitions. But the government has refused to actually lock that into a new target. In fact, it said it won't even be taking a new target to the next federal election, which is expected in a few months' time. It's really unfortunate. It shows that they're expecting a lot of things to happen very late in the next 30 years, very little to happen in the first 10 years, the decisive decade. Instead, fossil fuels are likely to only grow.
That said, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, has pledged investment of $15 billion in technology, research into ways of capturing carbon and so on that will make a difference. That is a big step forward, is it not?
It would if it wasn't just aggregating the budget of already existing renewable energy agencies in Australia. There doesn't seem to be actually that much in terms of new financing. And what new pledges have been put forward have been for fossil fuel-based technologies like carbon capture and storage, or like fossil fuel-based hydrogen. These are tools that are going to be used to extend the social license, the shelf life of fossil fuels, not necessarily to reduce emissions. So whilst it's great to see this money go forward, not necessarily towards the technologies that the Prime Minister is handpicking as the ones that he wants to see supported. The best thing the Australian government could do right now is adopt the IEA's net zero pathway. That means no new coal, no new gas. In fact, that's what 60% of Australians want, according to the Climate of the Nation survey.
OK, Richard Merzian from the Australia Institute think tank. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.